Hello and welcome to this brand new Blender Smoothie tutorial. In this tutorial I'll be teaching you how to create these northern lights as you can see in the video. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm just going to begin by deleting the default cube and the lamp. We'll be using the Cycles render engine and the lights will be providing all the light in the scene that we need anyway. I'm going to go ahead and press Shift A and we'll add a plane. Look at the top view here by pressing 7 on the number pad. Press Tab to go into edit mode. A to deselect everything, and we'll press B for box select and click and drag a box around these lowest two vertices down here, and we'll just press X and delete those vertices. And then I'll press A to select the remaining vertices right here, G, Y, we'll say -1 to center those right there, the object's point of origin. Now what we're going to do here is we're just going to subdivide this, W subdivide. Over here in the toolbar on the left, pull that up so you can see it a little bit better. We're going to give this more cuts, maybe about 10. And then we're going to subdivide it one more time. And I'm just going to right-click any one of these points. We're basically going to be moving these to give this a little more variation. I'm going to press O to turn on proportional editing. And what this allows you to do is if I move this, press G for example, then you'll see everything within this circle measured by a certain degree of fall off, sort of follows the vertex that I'm moving. So I'm going to scroll up with my mouse wheel to sort of move that in, and we'll just move that up a little bit, right click another area, maybe move that down, just sort of giving this a little variation. Something like that will work just fine. Then I'll press Tab to go back into object mode. We want to give this a little more subtle variation as well, so I'm going to go over here to the modifiers on the right, and I'm going to add a subsurf modifier, and turn on optimal display, and turn up the view settings to 2. The optimal display, actually it may make it run faster in the viewport, it may not, since it's only one line or one curved line. We probably don't need that actually, since it's not a three-dimensional object. But we'll turn up the view so that the resolution in the viewport is a little higher. And then I'm going to go ahead and add a displacement modifier. And this will allow us to give more finer detail to some areas. So I'm just going to press New next to this texture here. And if we go over to the texture settings up here, you'll see we have the displace texture loaded. I'm going to switch this from image or movie to clouds. And I'm going to bring down the size of these clouds to about 0.06. Something a lot smaller like that. We'll go back to the modifier and turn down the strength of this displacement modifier. Something like 0.1. That looks about right. And then I'm going to click the arrows and hide both of those. We'll add another subsurf modifier to help sort of smooth that out a little bit. We'll turn down the render level to 1 because we don't need a super high resolution for this part. And then I am going to, let's see here. I'm going to apply this first subsurf modifier and apply the displacement modifier. And I am then going to go into edit mode, pressing Tab, A to select everything, and I'm going to press E to extrude, and Z to lock it to the Z axis. And we'll sort of move this up maybe about that far. And then I'll press Tab to go back into object mode. And if we zoom in, we can sort of see some of these banded areas. And if we just go over here to the left, under shading and click smooth, that'll smooth those out. Okay, so the only other thing we want to do here is I want to give this a solidify modifier to give it a little bit of thickness, because this helps sort of sell the illusion a little bit better once we're adding the shaders and whatnot. So I'm going to go down in the modifiers over here and select the solidify modifier, and as you can see that's given this a little bit of thickness. And I might move this up so that it's before the subsurf modifier. And then I'm going to go into edit mode, press Ctrl R, and we're going to click right here so that we have an edge loop in the middle, and bring that down towards the bottom, right about here. And press Tab to go back into object mode. Now this doesn't really affect anything right now, but it will give us more control over the shader when we go to apply the variation and emission and color and whatnot. So this is pretty much it for the actual geometry. I might increase this level to 2 anyway. We may change that back, we'll see. But this will be it for the geometry. So from this point, we're going to move on and create a couple images in GIMP that we're going to use to help with the shader in this. Okay, so I've opened up GIMP here, and we're just going to start by going up to File, New, and we'll just give this, it doesn't really matter what the dimensions are, we'll just make this 1920 by 1080. That should work. And the first thing we're going to do before we mess with the colors or anything is we're going to create a map for the emission. And basically what this will do is I'm going to be mixing an emission shader with a transparent shader, and we're going to use this image as a mask. That'll make a little more sense when we go to do it, but for now, we're going to go ahead and we're going to work with a couple gradients here. So I'm going to leave the background the way it is. I'm going to go up to Layer. We'll go ahead and add a new layer. We'll just name this Gradient 1. And make sure that the colors you have selected over here are black and white. And I'm going to go up to the Gradient tool, or the Blend tool, and we're just going to start by, basically we're going to add a gradient to each side of this image so that there's no white that extends all the way to the edge of the image. So I'm just going to go ahead and start with the bottom here. And make sure you start with your cursor a little bit above the bottom of the image. This will ensure that there's complete black before the edges, and there really is no area where the white is touching the edges of the image. So we'll start a little bit above the bottom of the image, and I'm going to click and drag up, and I'm going to hold down Control, because that sort of locks the cursor in place and makes this a straight gradient. We'll move it up to about there. And then we're going to do the same, but I'm going to go ahead and add a new layer. We'll call this Gradient 2. And you'll see why we're doing this in layers in a second. I'm going to work from the top now. And again, I'll start a little bit away from the top, a little bit under the top, but we're going to hold down Control and click and drag and move this a lot farther down than we did the previous one. Maybe about that far. And the reason we're doing this in layers, as you can see, the white color here completely covered the other gradient. So we're going to have to come over here under Layers and Brushes here, where it says Mode Normal. We're going to want to change this from Normal to Multiply. And what Multiply does is it only allows the dark parts of the image to show through. It sort of keys out the lighter areas. So now you can see we have both of these gradients together on the same layer. And then from there, we're going to go ahead and create another layer. Call this Gradient 3. And we'll do the same thing from left to right. Again, start a little bit to the right of this side of the image. We'll move over not too far, maybe about that far. And again, we'll switch the mode up here from normal to multiply. And we'll do the same thing for the right side. We'll create one more new layer, make this Gradient 4. And we will do the exact same thing from the right side of the image. And switch the mode from normal to multiply. And there we go. There is a bit of a problem, though, as you can see. There are sort of these weird, lighter, sort of flare patterns where they're intersecting, and you don't really want that. So to fix that, first of all, we're going to go ahead and merge all of these layers. So I am going to, let's see here, we want to merge visible layers. We'll leave it on expanded as necessary. Click OK. And you can see it preserved the layer options and everything, so none of the gradients completely concealed any of the other ones. And now we're just going to go up to Filters and Blur, and we'll give this a Gaussian blur. And let's see here. You can sort of preview this. It's a little hard to preview here. We're going to go ahead and really bring that up. We'll experiment with a setting here, and we'll see if it works. We'll try about, we'll say 50. Let's see how that looks. We'll wait for that to render out. Okay, so it looks like it took effect. It's not quite enough, so I'll Control-Z to undo that. Let's try a blur of about 100. So we'll go ahead and type that in. 100. And okay, that works pretty well. So you can see it pretty much got rid of the weird flare shapes on either side, and it looks a lot smoother now. So from this point, we've pretty much got it where we want it. We have it fading out on all sides. The only other thing we want to do is we want to give it some variation on the inside. You'll see on a lot of Northern Lights, you can sort of see these striped patterns going up. And we want to sort of emulate that with this rather than in the colors. So I'm just going to come up here to Layer, and we'll create a new layer, and we'll call this Clouds, and we'll click OK. And what I'm going to do here is, first of all, we're going to give this a solid color. This layer needs a solid color. We'll go to the bucket tool, and we'll switch the foreground and background colors so that white is the foreground color. We'll just click here to paint it in. And then I'm going to switch those back. I'll go up to Filters, under Clouds, Render Clouds, Difference Clouds. And these are the settings you sort of want to emulate. We want to bring, I think they start out somewhere around here, but we want to bring the Y size all the way down and the X size all the way up. And as you can see in the preview, it gives us sort of these streak patterns going up from the bottom of the image to the top of the image. And that's sort of what we want. So we'll go ahead and click OK. And the reason we painted the layer first, by the way, is this method only works if there is a solid color already in the layer. It can't be completely blank. So we have the color here, or the clouds here, and we just want to change the mode from normal to multiply. And again, that only overlays the darker regions. So you can see now we have, they're much more integrated with the gradient pattern we set up in the background. All right, and this is pretty much it for the emission map. So I'm going to go up to File, and we want to export this. And under all export images, let's change this to PNG. It's a good file format to use. It's a lossless codec, so it retains all the quality. We'll go to Desktop, Archive. Let's go under Tutorials, Tutorial Files. We'll just drop it in there. And we'll call this, we'll just call this Emission Map. And we will export it. All the default settings for the PNG export are fine, so we'll go ahead and click Export. And you can see it working there, and all right, so that's taken care of. And at this point, all we have left to do is the color map. So we'll just go ahead and we'll create a new 1920 by 1080 file. We can go ahead and make this full screen, and we can close out of this other one. We don't need to save the changes, so we'll go ahead and discard changes. And here, all we want to do is create a nice color gradient. So the colors I'm going to be working with mainly are sort of a green and red kind of color. We'll just go ahead and create a new layer first, and we will call this, we'll just call this green-red, for green-red gradient. And I'm going to change the colors over here because we want to make sure they match the colors that we want. And I'm just going to find sort of a bright, very bright, almost spring green kind of color. And then here for the white, we'll switch that to something more like a sort of a reddish, almost pink kind of color. Something like that should work fine. And then we're just going to go ahead and use the gradient tool. And again, we'll click and drag from the bottom of the image and go all the way to the top, holding down Control to lock that into place. And we should get something like that. So that works out pretty well. And I want to add a little more color variation to this, so I'm going to go up to Layer, we'll add a new layer. We'll call this Refined Gradient. I don't know, it doesn't really matter what we name these as long as we keep them straight. And I am going to, let's see here. Basically, we just want to find, let's go ahead and we'll switch this from yellow, or from green to a sort of yellow-green. That's kind of the color I want on the bottom here. And let's go ahead and create that gradient. So let's start from the bottom here and sort of work our way up, but only move up about that far. And then I am going to just go ahead and grab the eraser tool. I feel like this will simplify things greatly. We'll bring up the size to something a lot greater. Yeah, something more like that. And looks like we'll just start erasing from the top down. And we'll leave a little bit left, just like that. And it's okay if it's not perfect. We don't want it to be perfect. We want there to be a little variation in this anyway, so make sure you try not to erase it in a completely straight line, because it adds a little realism if there's an imperfection of sorts in there. And basically, from that point, I'm just going to add one more layer. Make this a new layer. We'll call this right gradient. And we'll do the exact same thing from left to right. And, I think I'll actually put it on the left instead of the right. We'll leave this about the same color, but we'll make it a little yellower. Something like that. Maybe make it a little darker too. Right about there. And then we'll go ahead and use the gradient tool, and this time work from left to right. Again, holding down Control. Maybe we'll go about that far this time. And we'll grab the eraser tool again, and we'll sort of erase part of this off. And go down to about, we want this to be a little, we'll increase the size much more for this, because we want the fading to be a little more noticeable. So I'm going to bring that even farther up the size to about 1,000, maybe a little greater than that. It slows it down quite a bit. And we don't want this to be too visible, just a little bit on the left there. And so that should work out just fine. Okay, so this is it for the color. So we can go up to File, Export. We'll save it in the same spot as the other map. We'll just call this Color Map and leave the same PNG settings. All right, Export. Wait for this to save. This one will probably take a little longer because it's not black and white. We can go ahead and use these maps back in Blender then to create the variation and emission and color. Alright, so now we're ready to go ahead and apply these images to the model here. So before we go any farther, let's sort of set up a kind of a basic camera angle to work with here. So I'm going to press 1 to go into front view. And we'll press Control-Alt-0 to move the camera to our current frame of view. I'll sort of move this over a little bit, something like that, to try to center it. And we'll press R, hold down X, or tap X twice so that it rotates along its local X-axis. And we'll sort of rotate that up a little bit. And then I'm just going to press GZ, and we'll move this up. RZ to rotate it around the Z-axis. Maybe make it something like that. We'll scale it up a little bit too. Alright, so that should work pretty well. And we'll go ahead and over to the world settings, and we'll use nodes. We'll change this from gray to a nice black color, so we don't see anything and it's not a distracting background. And then at this point, it's all applying the images. So I'm just going to go ahead and split my view here. And we'll change this upper window to the node editor. And we'll go ahead and add a new shader. And we'll name this, I don't know, Aurora. It doesn't really matter. And I'm going to go ahead and split this window down here as well. And we're going to make this the UV image editor instead. And we'll go ahead and open the first image, which in our case will be the emission map. We'll go to Tutorials, Tutorial Files. I have it right here. Emission map, and we are just going to, let's see here, we'll just sort of move our way around this way until we're facing it about dead on. Press Tab to go into edit mode, tap A to select everything. You might have to tap it twice, and then we'll press U and project from view. And at this point what we want to do is over here, we'll make this a little bigger so we can see it a little better. We want to scale this and push it and pull it so that it matches the size of the image. So we'll press SX, and we'll press O to turn off proportional editing because we don't need that anymore. SX to scale it along the X-axis. We'll sort of move it over, just trying to align this with the edges of the image, and SY to scale it along the Y-axis. I'll continue to do that until it's pretty close at the very least. I'm not going to get it perfect, but there we go. Okay. And then we'll move this over. And one thing we want to do really quickly while I still remember it is let's go over to the object data here. And we're going to change the name of this UV map because we're actually going to have two UV maps. So we'll double click this and we'll just name this, we'll just name it Emit. And from this point, we can go ahead and press Tab to go back into object mode for now. Let's scroll out of here a little bit. I'm going to press up here in the nodes, Shift-A, shader. We'll add a mix shader. I'm going to duplicate this, or delete, sorry, this diffuse shader, and we'll replace it with an emission shader. And we'll make sure that color's all the way up there at white, not just sort of a light gray. Press Shift-A, and we'll add a transparent shader as well. So we're just mixing this emission shader with this transparent shader, and we can sort of go into rendered view to see this in real time. Go back to the camera view maybe. And I'm just going to, like I said before, we're going to use this image as a mask. to mix these two. So I'll press Shift-A, Texture, add an image texture, drop that in there. And from this drop-down menu, we'll just select Emission Map. And it looks like we actually have these inverted, so we'll want to switch the transparent with the emission. And there we go. It's working pretty well from there. We do want to tweak this emission map slightly, so I'm going to press Tab to go back into Edit mode. Over here in the image editor, we'll press A to deselect everything, B for box select, and we'll just drag a box around this second edge loop right here. I'll pull this out so we can see it a little bit better again. This middle edge loop. And I'm going to press GY, and we'll move it up pretty far along the y-axis. And as you can see over here, what this is doing is it's basically compressing the area between this middle loop and the end loop all in this geometry along here, which is a much bigger space than the actual mesh. So basically what we're doing, if you can see, is we're sort of making the top of the object a lot more transparent. And so if we move that pretty close to the top, we get something like that, which is more the effect that we're going for. It looks a lot more natural. And we might also sort of... No, it's a good spot. We'll leave it there. So at this point, what we can see here is the emission shader worked out pretty well. We just have to give this some color now. And to do that, we're just going to work with this emission node right here. So I'm going to pull this up so we can see it a little bit better. And we're going to, for the color right here, we are going to bring in that texture. So under image texture, we'll go ahead and add that. And we'll drop that right into the color. We'll go ahead and open. We'll go back to that same folder. We'll open the color map image. And you can see it's applied it, but we want the green to be up a little bit farther. It's sort of pushed down too far. And the reasoning for that is because it's using this UV map that we just created, where we moved that middle edge loop all the way up to the top. And we don't want it quite that extreme for the color. So we are going to, over here, again, under the Object Data button, under UV Maps, we're going to press the plus button to add a new UV map. We'll double-click that, and we'll name it Color. And in this UV map, to use this UV map, we're going to go ahead and press Shift-A up here in the nodes. Under Input, we'll use UV map and connect UV to the vector there in the image texture node. And we'll click on this drop-down menu, select Color. Now, we haven't actually done anything to this color UV map yet. So let's see here. We'll just switch in the image editor here. We'll switch from the emission map to the color map. And we'll press Tab to go into edit mode. And as you can see, it's sort of retained that same UV map that we had for the emission one. But we just want to move this down. All I did was Alt right-click to select this edge. We'll press GY to move this down. And you can sort of see this taking effect over there on the left. We can kind of see it moving up there. And we want to put it right about there. So we don't want to move it too much farther down, but we do definitely want it farther down than we had before. So something like that will work pretty nicely. Press Tab to go back into object mode. We'll move back over here. And I'm going to bring up the strength of this emission shader a little bit because it's a little dim. Maybe 2 will work pretty nicely. And that looks about right. And at this point, all that's left to do is we would just give it a render, and we would do a bit of compositing. It was pretty basic compositing. We'll just add a basic glow and everything. But before I wrap up this tutorial, I want to show you how to do one other thing, and that's to animate this. So you saw in the preview at the beginning of this video, lights were sort of rippling. And to do that effect, basically, we would have to, we already applied the displacement modifier, but if we were to animate this, we would sort of start out by adding a plane, doing what we did before, sort of deleting everything like that, moving it down along the y-axis, we'd subdivide it again, all that other stuff, subdivide it, and then we'd turn on proportional editing and sort of move these around, and then we would go ahead and add a subsurf modifier. And we would add a displacement modifier. And in this displacement modifier, we would use the same texture we used before, bring down the strength to 0.1, except the only difference is, in this case, we would basically press Shift-A, we would add an empty, plane axes, and we would use that empty to control the texture. So under texture coordinates here, we would switch that from local to object, and we would load that empty object. And now we would go ahead and go into edit mode, press E, Z to extrude along the Z axis. We would give that a smooth shading. We would apply the subsurf modifier actually before we did that, because we don't want all those extra edge loops in the middle, so we just bring that up like that to maintain that straightness. And as you can see, just as I was scaling it up and down, the empty is sort of affecting that. So if I go ahead and set the shading to smooth, and if we add another subsurf modifier with 2 levels and a solidify modifier, just like we did last time, move that up above that, and then add 1 more edge loop down there. What we have now is an animatable sort of light. So as you can see, if we move the empty, the texture moves along with it. And you could move this along the x-axis, you can move this along the y-axis, you can move this along the z-axis. I think I moved it along the z-axis in the preview. You could do any combination of those. And all that does is it adds a nice rippling effect to the lights that are already there. You may prefer this, you may not. It sort of adds more variation, as you can see, along the top and the bottom, so there's some slanting going on. I'm not really a huge fan of that, which is why I sort of left this perfectly straight up. But there are 2 different ways then that you could achieve this, and the texturing and shading is exactly the same. So that's pretty much it for this tutorial. I hope you learned something from it, and let me move this out of the way. I'd be happy to see what you come up with, as usual. And that's all, so I'll see you in the next one.